Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here today. Welcome to today's webinar, Guidelines for Establishing Standards and Practices in Private Land Conservation, a Framework for International Application. My name is Chandni Navalka, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm the Program Manager for the International Land Conservation Network, and I'm very glad to be hosting this session. Also listening in today is Jim Levitt, Director of the International Land Conservation Network, which I'll call the ILCN from now on. Many of you may already be familiar with the ILCN, but for those of you who might be new to us, we're a global network of private and civic land conservation leaders and practitioners. We share expertise and experience to build capacity to advance and accelerate the protection of land and water resources around the world. Our webinar today falls into one of our 4 key thematic areas, which focuses on strengthening organization and governance amongst land conservation organizations to build trust and enhance impact. I'm so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Sylvia Bates. Sylvia is the Director of Standards and Educational Services at the Land Trust Alliance and has been a member of the ILCN Steering Committee since its founding in 2014. During this session, she'll share how the Land Trust Alliance came to develop the Land Trust standards and practices and how these ethical and technical guidelines can and are being used and adapted beyond the United States. Sylvia's presentation today reflects her 2019 publication on this topic for the ILCN, which is available on the resources page of our website. Before we start today, let me quickly go over a few items about this presentation and the webinar platform. First, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question or a comment for our speaker, please feel free to send it by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question and send it to us, and we'll notify you if we plan to answer it. We will be answering questions submitted through the Q&A at the end of Sylvia's presentation. If we don't get to your question today, we'll be sure to follow up afterward. Next, you may see in your controls a chat and raise hand option. We won't be using those functions today, so please use the Q&A tool only. And lastly, today's webinar will be recorded in the cloud. The recording will be available at our website, landconservationnetwork.org, on our resources page if you or your colleagues should wish to reference it in the future. So with that, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming Sylvia. Sylvia, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Chandni. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you great.
Great. All right, let me know if I start to fade out. Hi, everybody. This is Sylvia Bates. Nice to be here. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. I want to start by, for those of you who haven't seen the publication yet, just give you a little bit of background before we launch into the presentation. And then I will talk for about 20-25 minutes or so, and then we should have plenty of time to have a good dialogue, questions and answers, and a discussion, and we'll wrap up by 4 p.m. So in the United States, land trusts have known that for private land conservation to succeed over the long term, we've known for a long time that we need to make sure that we secure the public's confidence and support. All land trusts in the US have to demonstrate effectiveness, credibility. Otherwise, the ones that fall short could undermine the whole conservation movement. So establishing and implementing standards and practices is important and can help meet that challenge. And as private land conservation initiatives grow and mature in other countries, many are considering and have already established their own standards and practices to make sure that their work in private land conservation also reflects integrity. So standards and practices can help protect the investment of public and private financial resources in land conservation. They can serve as a catalyst for organizations and individuals to strive for excellence in their operations and activities. And lastly, and perhaps even most importantly, they can help ensure the permanent protection of conserved properties. So next slide, please, Chandni. So I want to give you a little bit of background about the Land Trust Alliance for those of you who may not be familiar with us. And then talk about the history and context of how the standards and practices were developed in the United States. And then we'll give you a couple of examples using Canada, Catalonia, and Chile about how other countries are developing and using their standards and practices. And lastly, I'll wrap up with some guidelines and tips for successful processes if you're considering establishing your own standards and practices. Next slide, please. So the Land Trust Alliance is a national conservation organization that was founded in 1982, and we represent more than 1,000 member land trusts supported by more than 5 million members nationwide. Next slide, please. Our goals are basically four-pronged: to elevate land conservation as a priority nationwide, to increase the rate of conservation, to build healthy, high-performing land trusts, and to defend the land trust community from threats, including threats to conservation land. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have more than 1,000 member land trusts. There are almost 440 accredited land trusts, and I'll talk about our accreditation program in a little bit. And together, our private nonprofit land trusts across the country have protected more than 56 million acres of land. So I'm not quite sure what that converts into hectares. I should have figured that out earlier. Next slide, please. So I think most of you will understand that at the time of the Alliance's founding, in 1982, there were only about 400 local and regional land trusts that existed in the United States, most of those in the Northeast, and they were often very small. So during the 1980s in the US, we had an explosive development trend all across the United States, which really spurred conservation efforts throughout the country. The 1980s saw a surge in growth in the number of land trusts and also in the use of conservation easements as a private land protection tool. And that growth trend that began at the end of the 1980s set the pace for the next 10 years, when more than 63% of the nation's land trusts formed. Today, there are approximately 1,300 land trusts across the country that have protected that 56 million acres that I mentioned before, which is an increase of 9 million acres since 2010. Conservation easements cover approximately 17 million acres in the United States. Next slide, please. So one of the things we do is work to build healthy, high-performing land trusts. And anyone who has watched the use of conservation easements grow over the last 30 years understands what a compelling tool easements are for protecting endangered areas, scenic properties, working farms and forests, and so on. But yet anyone who also understands conservation easements is acutely aware of how much work protecting land begins after the easement is signed. Monitoring and enforcement are tasks for perpetuity. So very early on, the Alliance recognized the challenge of perpetuity and how we can keep lands protected that we protected forever, and the importance of establishing standards and practices in order to assist with that. So the standards and practices, as Shani said, are the ethical and technical guidelines for the responsible operation of a land trust. Next slide, please. So the Alliance first developed the standards in 1989 at the urging of land trust practitioners who, remember, we were undergoing an explosive growth of land trusts at the time. And these land trust practitioners during that time period really believed that a strong land trust community depends on the credibility and effectiveness of all its members. And they also understood that employing standards and practices was going to be the surest way to lasting conservation. So the standards and practices have been around since 1989. We had a major revision in 2004, and then most recently, the standards and practices were revised again in 2017. Next slide, please. So in all that time period, there are certain themes that run through the standards and practices, and I alluded to this already, that the credibility of our community rests on the legal and ethical action of all its members. There's also the theme of land trusts being responsive to their communities, engaging their communities, that is a very important theme and is reflected in the standards and practices. Next slide, please. That to be a sustainable organization, you need to rely on written documentation, policies and procedures, and there needs to be financial stability for the organization to continue to exist and fulfill its obligations. And lastly, the themes that you see through the standards and practices include a big emphasis on stewardship and defense, that it's very important for us to fulfill our obligations, protect the land, make sure that the lands that we've protected today stay protected tomorrow. And that includes ensuring that we have the capacity for lasting protection of land. Next slide, please. So the standards themselves are broken into 12 standards that run in these broad areas of governance, strong organizations, land protection, and stewardship. So those are the overarching areas that the standards covers. In the publication, for those of you that had the chance to look, download it, or if you're interested in downloading it later and taking a look, we did include two broad frameworks and templates of how you might create your own standards and the important topical areas that those standards might cover. So I think if you're interested in looking at that, a lot of it's modeled after the 12 standards here, but not exclusively. There are also a lot of opportunity for you to adjust depending on your jurisdiction and what's important to your community that you're working in. Next slide, please. So from the Land Trust Alliance's perspective, we require that all our members have to adopt the Land Trust standards and practices. And they are encouraged to implement them at the standards at a pace appropriate for their organizations, but they do have to adopt them. Next slide, please. And from our perspective, adoption basically means that the organization has reviewed them, their board has voted to accept them as the technical and ethical guidelines for the responsible operation of a land trust, and their organization has made a commitment to actually implementing them in their organization. So basically what that means is that not necessarily every organization in the US is completely following every single practice to the letter, but that the spirit and intent of their operations is consistent with the standards, and they've committed to making progress and implementing them in their organizations. Next slide, please. So we do have the standards and practices, the US version of the standards and practices, translated into Spanish and French, and that is available on our website for those of you who are interested in pulling that down as well. Next slide. And then I want to just touch briefly on accreditation. While the standards are the guidelines for an organization's operations, we also have a land trust accreditation program, which is basically a mark of distinction showing that the land trust actually meets those high standards for land conservation. The Alliance had long considered establishing some form of credentialing program based on the standards as early as the late 1990s. But it was the Land Trust Accreditation Commission we established as an independent program of the Alliance back in 2006. So it's governed by a voluntary board of diverse land conservation and nonprofit management experts from around the country that actually review and make decisions on applications to the program. It is voluntary, it's not a requirement, but it is a mark of distinction for organizations that do achieve accreditation. Next slide, please. So the goals of the accreditation program, the primary goals, are to build and recognize strong land trusts, foster public confidence in land conservation, and help ensure the long-term protection of land. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have about 440 accredited land trusts. And we had a study, an evaluation done 2 years ago in 2018 on the impact of the accreditation program's first year of operation on the land trust community. And it really does show that, 15 years ago, the land trust community was, unfortunately in the US, was ill prepared to live up to the promise of perpetuity. And the Alliance created the accreditation program and the Land Trust Accreditation Commission as a solution to help raise all boats, if you will. So the accredited land trusts really do demonstrate that they have fiscal accountability, strong organizational leadership, sound transactions, lasting stewardship. So accreditation was a very strong motivator for change in land trusts. 87% of accredited land trusts state that accreditation moderately or substantially motivated them to make organizational improvements. And these groups were able to strengthen their governance, their transactions, their stewardships, and their financial systems as part of that accreditation journey. And interestingly enough, now with the 440 accredited land trusts that we have across the country, even more significant here is that 80% of the total acres owned or under easement are held by an accredited land trust. So I think those figures speak volumes in terms of the program itself. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit about background about the US standards and the accreditation program, and we can go into more detail if people are interested when we get to the discussion section. But I did want to spend some time talking about how other countries are developing and using our standards and practices as a model. So let's go to the next slide, please. First, I'll start with Canada. So the Canadian Land Trust Alliance first adapted the US standards for use in Canada back in 2005. So that was just subsequent to the major 2004 revision that we did with the US standards. So at that time, it was the Canadian Land Trust Alliance with assistance from the Ontario Land Trust Alliance and the Land Trust Alliance of British Columbia. So after we revised our standards in 2017, just fairly recently, the Canadian Land Trust Alliance, with help from the Nature Conservancy of Canada, followed suit and published the revised Canadian Land Trust Standards and Practices last January. So given the similarities in law and culture between the United States and Canada, the Canadian standards, not surprisingly, are modeled very closely after the US standards. They follow that 12 standard model. They have similar practices under each of those 12 standards as the US model does. For Canadians, although right now the adoption of standards is also entirely voluntary, there are at least two federal programs where, in order to participate in those federal programs and secure federal funding, the adoption is mandatory. It's an eligibility requirement. And that's the Ecological Gifts Program and the Natural Areas Conservation Program. The other interesting thing about Canada is also last year, the Canadian Land Trust Alliance, with help from NCC, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, created what's called the Center for Conservation in Canada. The Center for Conservation now is exploring a land trust accreditation program that would actually involve some kind of credentialing program like the US Land Trust Accreditation Program. So they are researching that now, and are actually next week are going to be hosting a forum for land trusts across Canada in Ottawa to see whether this is something they want to pursue. I don't know if anyone's on the call here on the webinar from Canada, but if you are, maybe you can add to this discussion when we get to the discussion section. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And this is an effort that has already occurred and is continuing actually in Catalonia and Spain. And if you pardon my poor pronunciation in Spanish, This is an effort that was established in 2003 by the Zara per la Conservació de la Natura, or we'll just call them XCN, formerly XCT. And they're a national conservation organization that represents more than 170 land trusts, environmental organizations, and public institutions in Catalonia. XCN works, their work focuses on supporting their members and on stewardship issues. And they're sort of like an alliance of land trusts, like the Land Trust Alliances. So in 2013, they drafted a Guía de Buenas Prácticas para la Custodia del Territorio. And so in English, that translates to Land Stewardship Guidelines. And then in 2018, they published a revised version. And what this is, it's basically the US standards definitely inspired and informed these guidelines, these stewardship guidelines. And the handbook that they created follows a similar general structure, with the first part covering organizational management issues and a second section focusing on land stewardship. XCN does not require land trusts to adopt these standards, but strongly recommends it. And right now in Catalonia, the civic and private nature conservation movement is very strong, but they still need a lot of work in terms of the organizations fully implementing the standards themselves. So let's move on, and next slide, please, and talk a little bit about Chile. So I know there are a number of folks that may be on the webinar that are from Chile, so I hope you'll contribute to the discussion when we get to that point. Private land conservation in Chile has been steadily accelerating for more than a decade. And while the work has been very strategic, and the conservation leaders in Chile have often looked very closely to the United States in general and to the Land Trust Alliance particularly as a model, they don't yet have not yet completed their formal standard setting process. But just recently, within the past year, the Chile's only fully functioning land trust, Fundación Tierra Austral, in conjunction with another NGO, Así Conserva Chile, which is a national service organization that represents owners of private protected areas, they jointly received a grant I think it was last December 2018, so about a year ago. They jointly received a grant from an organization, an institution, government institution under the Ministry of Environment called Innova Corfo. And the purpose of this grant was to draft and disseminate best practice templates for private conservation agreements in Chile. Primarily, this effort was planned to focus on Chile's new private land conservation and enabling statute and the expected increased use of the Derecho Real de Conservation Agreement. So they've been working on this for the past year. And I know in November, I believe it was November or December of 2019, they basically issued their first draft of the standards for public comment and review. And I think, I believe Diego Tabila, who's involved in that effort, is on the webinar. So maybe, as is Victoria Alonso, some who are deeply involved in the standard setting effort in Chile. So perhaps they can give us an update as to where things stand. But I do think that this, the Corfo grant that they received is really an important opportunity for the Chileans to professionalize their land trust practices in Chile. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity. So I think those are our three examples. And before we open it up for discussion, let me just wrap up with just a quick summary to talk a little bit about some guidelines and tips for a successful process and things that we've learned from our own process here in the United States after 15 years with living with different types of standards, or 1989, almost more than that, more than 20, almost 30 years. So let's go to the next slide. So I think I'll start by saying that standards and practices and engaging practitioners to implement them successfully takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and often a lot of resources. One tip we'll offer here is that it's really important to lay the groundwork through an initial planning process. In the beginning, you're going to, if you're interested in establishing standards in your jurisdiction, you need to make some kind of determination whether the time is right to do so or to revise your standards. So a lot of the circumstances will vary depending on what the political, cultural, legal context of private land conservation is in your country or jurisdiction. It took a long time in Chile for them to reach a point where now they do have a draft set of standards, but that was after years and years of detailed, involved discussions and conversations. Another point here that we want to make is the importance of creating a transparent process to involve all the stakeholders. Whatever process or approach you use, I think it's really important that the process is transparent, that you find a way to generate relevant feedback from all stakeholders in your community, including those who are peripherally involved. So having a method to get feedback, to get buy-in is going to be critical to whether or not your standards and practices that you come up with are going to be accepted. People need to be involved and be part of the process. I think that's fairly self-evident. We also found that, certainly from the United States perspective, establishing a core team to actually work effectively together to guide the entire process, to define how the overall system is going to work, to identify the goals and the outcomes for establishing standards and practices, to oversee the details of the process. Having a group of 4 to 6 people as a core team is critical. And then you can have a larger advisory group who can represent the stakeholders that we're going to be affected by and expected to follow the standards and practices. So I think that what we found certainly in our revision process is the team's role, the advisory team's role, is very helpful in advising the core team to make sure that the full range of stakeholder perspectives and concerns are understood and considered. The other thing I think is providing a way for people to, a variety of ways for people to provide feedback. People are going to have an opportunity to provide comment on any preliminary draft of a set of standards and practices. And then they need to know that they are actually, that you've actually listened to their comments and feedback and incorporated changes as a result. And I think in this day and age of technology, there is a wide variety of ways for you to offer people opportunities for feedback. We actually, in the United States, for our last revision round, we actually used a online format. There are many commercially available online public engagement platforms out there, and they can be very cost effective to collect a lot of comments and to allow a lot of participants to participate and also review and view comments made by others. They're sort of like social media tools and platforms. The next thing you're going to need, I think, is a detailed communications plan. And the communications plan is really going to help you when you go out and collect in feedback on the standards and practices themselves as you're going through the revision process or the creation process. And it's also going to help when you are ready to launch the standards themselves. And lastly, I can't underemphasize the importance of implementation. You're going to need to consider how you can ensure that the community of stakeholders, your community of stakeholders, whoever they may be, understands the standards and practices and is taking steps to actually incorporate them into their operations, into their activities, and into their programs. So at the very beginning, this will generally involve some form of education and outreach, such as discussion forums, workshops, over a longer period of time. It might take more training opportunities, more intense training opportunities. There are assessment tools that we created for land trust standards and practices that you might think about creating in terms of organizations evaluating their how they are doing in implementing land trust standards and practice, or whatever practices, best practices you create. And ultimately, you might decide that some kind of third-party verification or accreditation program is going to be the best way that you can measure implementation of standards and practices among your constituency. So I think I will stop there and maybe go to the next slide. I think that was the last one. Yes. Okay. So we've got about a half an hour left for discussion and questions, and I will turn it over to Shanni to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. So as we said, and for those of you who dialed in a little bit later, we want to hear from you, and you can send us your questions or comments via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time. And just raise your hand if you have a hard time doing that, but you can just type it in and send it to us. I think I'm going to start off just by sharing one question that's come in already from Jessica Owley. What do you view as the relationship between standards and practices and accreditation?
Well, that is a big question. Jessica, how are you? Nice to hear from you. Well, the relationship between standards and practices and accreditation. So the standards are the guidelines for the responsible and ethical operation of a land trust. And the standards are themselves voluntary. I mean, we as a Land Trust Alliance require members to adopt, but we're not actually out there verifying compliance, that they're actually implementing the standards in their operations. That's the job of the Accreditation Commission. So the Accreditation Commission and our voluntary accreditation program will actually evaluate land trusts based on how well they are implementing the standards and practices. They don't look at all standards. They look at a subset of the standards called what we call the indicator elements. And so they actually evaluate by reviewing organizations' applications for accreditation to make sure that they have the right policies in place, that their financial systems are sustainable, and that they are implementing the standards in their projects, such as in their land transactions and in terms of how they're conducting their stewardship. So that's the relationship between the standards and accreditation. So standards form the framework. We require adoption of the standards, and then accreditation is actual verification by a third party that the standards are being implemented.
Thanks, Sylvia. We have another question from Tillman Disselhoff. No one likes to be told what to do. Has there ever been opposition against standards and practices or accreditation, and by whom?
Hi, Tillman. Nice to hear from you too. You're absolutely right. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Yes, we get that all the time. But I think in terms of opposition to the standards, I think even from the beginning, there were very, very few naysayers. I think people really recognized that the standards were going to be an important way to maintain the public trust and ensure that the investment, the public investment, because in the U.S., there is we are charitable organizations, and people do get tax benefits for making donations to these organizations in the U.S. And I'm talking about money, financial donations, as well as land and easements. So it's that public investment that was extremely important, and just the integrity of these nonprofit organizations. So I think there was consensus that the standards and practices are one sure way of ensuring that we maintain that public trust. I also think because of the public participation processes that we've had over the 30 years of our land trust standards and practices, it didn't just happen overnight. They've been through 3 major revisions. And we've always had a very open public participation forum and process. And we've actually changed things significantly based on the feedback that we received. So I think that was critical. I also think that from an accreditation standpoint, yes, we did have some pushback, and I think I think there has been some pushback on the accreditation piece. And of course, once you sort of go from the stage of, yes, we're doing it, to prove to me that you're doing it, that you're implementing the standards, it's a little bit trickier. So I think while there has been, over the years, I think there's been some pushback on the accreditation piece. I think the evidence that it's been successful in 15 years. We have 440 accredited land trusts, as I mentioned, that have done excellent work and are now stronger organizations for having gone through the process. They have systems in place that we know are working to protect the land, and their stewardship results are much, are consistently greater than non-accredited land trusts. So so while there has been some, I think we've been able to overcome a lot of the resistance, if you will.
Thanks, Sylvia. We have another question from Constanza Kobos. What standards do you think are the most difficult to accredit?
Oh, that is a tricky question. So I'm not quite sure if I know whether the question, Constanza, means, are you asking for most difficult for land trusts to meet, or from the accreditation commission's point of view are the most difficult to evaluate? So maybe I'll try it both ways. I think land trusts struggle in the US anyway, they probably do in other countries, with primarily with being financially sustainable. That is one of the most difficult sort of practices, the whole financial health section of the standards and practices that organizations do struggle sometimes with, having the financial systems in place to make sure that, many of these organizations are all volunteer, to make sure that they do have the financial systems in place that they can adequately fulfill their responsibilities and continue their work. So that's an area where I think people struggle. Another area where land trusts struggle in the US, I think, has to do, I won't go too far down in the weeds on this, but it has to do with some of the tax requirements, some of the legal requirements for tax deductible conservation easements, such as appraisals. Again, probably not time to get into the nuances of that, but that's another area where we're seeing land trusts having some difficulty. I think from the Accreditation Commission standpoint, I would say that their challenges have also been revolved around developing, we set the practices and the standards. The Accreditation Commission sets the specific requirements for how they're going to measure that. And I'll give you an example. We have a practice that requires annual monitoring of conservation easements. So you have to go out once a year and monitor your easements. How do you define annual? Is it, calendar year? Is it February 21st, 2018 to February 21st, 2019? And what if you miss one? So I think that the commission struggles with interpreting some of the practices to make them consistent so that everyone is being evaluated along the same spectrum, and that the commission is being fair and transparent in how they do that. So I think that's what the hardest part is for the commissions from that perspective.
Great. I have a question from Glenn Thode, who's from a Dutch law-based organization, and he's just asking if you could explain the term in easement. And a related question from Angela Salsi, who's asking, what happens if a land trust closes down? What happens to the easement and where is it stored?
Okay, so good questions, great. So a conservation easement is a legal agreement between a landowner and a conservation organization or a government agency. And this is how it works in the United States and Canada. That basically restricts the amount and type of development that can occur on the property. So the owner still remains the private landowner, but the land trust or the government agency holds the right to monitor and enforce those restrictions on the property. So the owner of the property, say, can no longer develop the property and put up 10 houses. They have to keep the land as agricultural land, as open space, as a natural area, as forest land, whatever the conservation value of that property is. And the conservation easement is held by the land trust. It's a legal document. And the land trust promises to enforce those terms to make sure that whoever owns the property in the future, they're still, those restrictions still apply to all future owners of the property. And the land trust is bound to enforce those terms against future owners as well. So the property remains protected in perpetuity. And this is it's a statutory, every state has what's called a conservation easement enabling statute to allow this legally from a state perspective. And then from a federal perspective, there is federal tax law that basically makes donors of these conservation easements eligible for tax benefits, income tax benefits for granting an easement. So the second question from Angela was basically, what happens if the organization goes out of business? Was that the question, Shandi? Was that the question, Shandi? Did I get that right? If the organization,
if the land trust goes out of business or closes down, or for some reason,
right. So there's a couple of answers to that. So every conservation easement, the way that it's written legally, has a clause in it that basically says what happens. At the very least, the easement continues to exist. It does not go away. It is basically assigned through the state, through the court process. We'll figure out who the new holder of a conservation easement could be. In the US, the only way a conservation easement can be extinguished is through a court process. There has to be a court proceeding. So if a land trust goes out of business, they will have their assets distributed, including their conservation easements, by the court. Many conservation easements have a backup holder. So if we're dealing with a small all-voluntary land trust in Connecticut, for example, in New England here, where I live, in this part of the country, we have a lot of small land trusts. They may say in their conservation easement language and have a clause that has what's called a backup holder or an executory interest, so that if they ever go out of business, their easements are then transferred to another organization, a like-minded organization that that agrees to accept the easement and take on those obligations.
Great. I have two related questions, I think, from Veronique Vermette and Natalie Pratt. Veronique asks, in your opinion, should an accreditation be modulated in order to serve all types of land trust, which means being more severe for larger organizations or simpler and less formal for volunteer-based land trusts? And then Natalie's question also asks, should accreditation take into account different sizes and types of land trusts?
So when the accreditation program here in the US, when we designed our accreditation program, and we were very conscious of not creating a two-tiered system. We did not want to, so in other words, we wanted to be able to treat every organization the same, regardless of whether it's a small land trust or a large land trust, because their obligations are the same. They all have to fulfill their stewardship obligations of making sure they're managing their land appropriately and making sure they're defending their conservation easements. So it doesn't matter if you're a large organization or a small organization. So we were very conscious of not treating organizations differently, although we did have a lengthy discussion about that, but that's where we came down on. I will say that for smaller organizations, surprisingly, it is not the smaller organizations that have struggled the most with the accreditation program. It is the larger, older organizations that have had a history of many easements, a lot of land protected, and systems that, that were, 30, 40 years old, that predated the standards being issued. So they had, the smaller organizations generally have less work to do in order to meet accreditation standards than the larger organizations may, because there's just less baggage often.
Thanks, Sylvia. And I think that ties into Susan Walmer's question. She's writing in and participating from Ontario, Canada. Susan's asking, do we have accredited organizations which are run primarily by volunteers? And do you have any advice or recommendations for organizations that may not have multiple full-time staff?
Yes, again, yes, we do, Susan. We have, and I wish I don't have that on the top of my head, how many volunteer land trusts out of that 440, but it's at least 50, I would say, off the top of my head. So we do have a number, or that have one part-time staff or small. But I think for those organizations, I think the advice to offer is just, and for any accreditation program, is it takes time. When we first launched the accreditation program 15 years ago, we were actually surprised that land trusts were not as ready for the program as we thought. And the program has undergone a number of revisions in that 15-year period. We've dropped some of the indicator practices, we've changed the requirements. The commission has looked at a number of different ways to streamline the program and make it easier and more, well, not compromising quality, but making it easier for land trusts to apply. But I would say that smaller land trusts, again, I think you need the time for implementation for an accreditation program. And while we spent a lot of time in the early years of the program building up the strength of small land trusts, we had a scholarship program and an assessment program where we actually invested money to help organizations evaluate, do an assessment, evaluate where they are vis-a-vis the practices, the standards and practices, and develop an implementation plan to help them actually implement them before they actually applied for accreditation. So time is a big thing, and often some resources to help for implementing and getting organizations to where they should be before they apply for accreditation.
Great. Sylvia, one last question about accreditation from Joffrey Rodrigo. Was the government involved in any stage of the process for building the standards and practices or the accreditation program?
That's a really good question, Joffrey, and the quick answer to that is no. We do have, in the US, we do have some organizations that are quasi-governmental, and what that means is that they are associated with government, but they have a private, independent decision-making board. And we do have a number of those that are accredited, and we created a special interpretation document for those organizations. Because of the way they were structured, there were some practices that they just couldn't meet legally. So we had to interpret, if you will, the practices for them so that they could be accredited. But in general, the government has not been involved. Although the government, in many cases, certainly certain federal programs, and I suspect some state programs as well, look to those organizations, look to the accredited organizations before they award funding. So I think that's been the sort of the level of government involvement in the standards, but no direct involvement.
Great. We have a question from Henok Sanangba, who I believe is from the Central African Republic, who's asking for a clarification on what you meant when you were talking about the stakeholder feedback and input process. And he's wondering if you can give an example of such a process.
So when you're establishing standards and practices, you have a constituency that is going to be out there that is going to be affected by those standards and practices. Your land trusts are your stakeholders in US, let's say in the United States. The other stakeholders are, we have funders that are stakeholders. We have landowners and donors that might be stakeholders. We have community members that might be stakeholders. So I think when I use the term stakeholders, I'm using it fairly broadly. But some way, you want to figure out some way to hear from as many people as possible, certainly from those people that are going to be impacted by any standards and practices that you set. And that could be, you know, a range of different communities. It could be maybe it's a university community that will be impacted. Maybe it'll be the farmers in your region. I'm not quite sure who your constituencies are.
Great. Thanks for that, Sylvia. A question again from Glenn Thode that I think might be of interest. Are foreign organizations who may be new nature conservation organizations able to accredit their standards and practices with the US-based accrediting system?
No, not at this time. We have enough on our hands with just land trusts, so we only accredit US-based land trusts that are 501c3 organizations that operate in the United States, and we have some other eligibility requirements, but that's the big one. Right now, we have not spread out beyond the US. And have no plans to. I don't think we have any plans to do so.
Great. So I think we have time for two more questions. One's coming in from Renato Woodward from New Brunswick, Canada. What are the most visible consequences of organizations that did not choose to get accredited?
Well, you have to remember there are 1,300 land trusts in the United States. 900 of those, 1,000 of those are members of the Land Trust Alliance. And there are only, about 440 of those that are accredited. So I think I would say there, in the US anyway, we have a lot of small all-volunteer organizations. They may have one or two properties. They just may be, Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, very small state, has more than 110 land trusts. So does the state of Massachusetts. So there are a lot of organizations that just aren't, for whatever reason, accreditation is not a road that they are going to go down. I think that I would rather respond to your question in the reverse. It's not what has been it's not what is the downside for those organizations. Really, what is the upside for those organizations that have chosen to get accredited and continue to get accredited? And all our evaluation metrics show that they are stronger. They've got better financial systems. Funders are now looking to those organizations. Donors are looking to see whether these organizations are accredited. So it has had a positive impact. It's less clear what whether there is a direct negative impact for organizations not getting accredited.
Great. And our last question coming from Tillman Disselhoff. Are there any differences between US states that the standards and practices or accreditation needed to take into account?
Differences in states? I'm sorry, in US states? Is that what the question was?
Right. Whether they needed to be different to take into account differences between the states.
Yeah, no, not really, Tillman. The only difference might be when there is an evaluation, when the commission takes a look at the language in the conservation easements that have been drafted, because those are all creatures of state law, or perhaps bylaws of the organizations. But by and large, they're not the accreditation requirements are not that detailed in that regard to actually look at statewide differences. And I think there probably would be very few.
Great. Well, Sylvia, I know that you have to get going and that many people on the line will have to leave as well. So thank you to everyone for your questions and attention today. And special thanks to you, Sylvia, for your presentation and for sharing your expertise on this topic, which is so important for this field.
You're so welcome. And I would just add in closing, I really thank everybody for attending today. And there were a lot of great questions, and I encourage you to go to the ILCN website and download the publication, because I think you'll find that some of your questions will be answered there in more detail. Thank you, Shani, for hosting.
Great. Thanks to all. Take care, and we
All right. Bye, everybody.
soon. Bye.
Thank you.